reporters to see firsthand the impact of this race to reform.
Nadam, the annual celebration of Mongolia's distinctive heritage and national heroes. This honorary guard represents the 7 tribes which made up Genghis Khan's all-conquering army, an army which ruled over almost a third of the world in the 13th century, an empire stretching from Vienna to Vietnam. Nadam celebrates both a remarkable past and a more modest present-day achievement, that Mongolia still remains an independent nation despite being sandwiched between 2 giant neighbors, Russia and China. Poor, landlocked, and with a population of only just over 2 million, Mongolia was for 70 years dominated by Moscow. Until independence in 1991, Nadam had been hijacked as a people's celebration, an offering of thanks to Stalin and his successors for the brutal butchery of many Mongolians and the rape of the country's assets. Now it's a sometimes bizarre demonstration of national character. The nation's sporting heroes, the wrestlers, limber and lumber, imitating the movements of the mythical bird of prey, the Garudi, to bring them luck.
Nadam is a celebration of the 3 manly sports, wrestling, archery, and as here, horse racing for all ages. And people have been travelling from all over Mongolia to attend this, the largest festival of them all. The horse, now as 700 years ago, the heart of Mongolia. The first Pony Express service was invented here. Mongolia's mounted warriors for a time were unstoppable. They struck terror into the hearts of the Chinese, who built the Great Wall to stop their relentless advance. But there was nothing great about the wall to the Mongolians. They called it the White Wall, and China too fell victim to Mongolian horse skills. Some of these riders are as young as 7. They've been riding almost since they could walk. Their horsemanship is revered. In a classic Mongolian film, it's the horseman who gets the girl, rather than his motorbike and car-driving rivals. And when you add Mongolian skills in archery, it's not difficult to see why even the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor trembled in front of the walls of Vienna in fear of a Mongolian onslaught. Today, there's continuing pride in these skills. The most popular and most successful politicians are the ones who can demonstrate the warrior skills of their ancestors. This archer is the Speaker of the Mongolian Parliament and the leader of the Social Democratic Party. A score of 4 out of 6 will keep him in office, at least until the next Nadam. He's surrounded by politicians from the other political parties which have sprung up since 1991. Multi-party democracy is now enshrined in the Mongolian constitution, the result of 6 years of frantic reform. Political independence is now well-founded, but economic independence is far from secure. Until the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union was Mongolia's underwriter. The dead but guiding hand of Moscow was everywhere, the paternal hand of friendship, backed by a fearsome military presence in this sensitive buffer zone. The collapse of aid and trade sent the economy into a desperate decline. Progress in the 1990s has been slow and painful, with severe social consequences.
We're seeing a spread of alcoholism and high unemployment. Family traditions have been lost. There's violence in the family against women and children. The old socialist state provided everything free, health services and education and many other things. The people who used to get handouts from the state are reluctant to take responsibility for their own lives. They don't know how to accept personal responsibility for their actions.
One of the peculiarities of Mongolian reform is that both economic and political reforms have been taking place at the same time, and is concerned the political reforms. No doubt Mongolia is leader in the transition economies. Everything took place very smoothly, without any gun, without any revolution. All these changes took place through elections. As concerned economic reforms, it has been taking place with difficulties because of these reforms. There is unemployment increase, and also poverty increased, and jobless people, and therefore there is more social pains, and our new government's policies that short-term pain and long-term gain, and therefore we would like to accelerate these economic reforms.
To help with the awesome task of creating a viable economy, the Mongolian government has opened its doors to international economists and the new invading hordes, the consultants and advisors. The new sages aren't Russian or Chinese, they're Western, many surprisingly from New Zealand. David Butcher is a former New Zealand trade minister who's been in Mongolia for many months. He says that the surfeit of advice has led to bad decisions.
I think Mongolia's problem has been perhaps a lack of sophistication, and they've been very prey to sort of snake oil merchants who come along and offer quick fix solutions. I think, however, there's a growing level of sophistication, and people are becoming much more aware of how the international business community operates. Far more people are now looking to run their own businesses rather than relying on government employment, for example.
Now, what's the New Zealand government's interest in funding a project here in Mongolia?
I'm not quite sure about that. Mongolians feel very comfortable with New Zealand because there are actually a number of similarities despite their obvious differences. We're both very small populations in a large geographic area, both very geographically isolated, both heavily dependent on sheep meat, both have a history of strong state involvement in the economy, and both have a history of one major trading partner. So the Mongolians feel very comfortable with the sort of advice they get from New Zealand as opposed, say, to the advice from Europe or North America.
Money is finally coming into the country as specific foreign investment and in more speculative forms. It's mostly centred on the country's potential abundance of natural resources: oil, gold, copper, coal, and even its developing Kashmir industry are all attracting foreign investment. But there's little experience of dealing with international business.
What have been some of the principal problems that you've had to overcome in order to set this up?
Bureaucracy. The Mongolians, it's not entirely their fault. You know, it was a quantum leap for them in 1990 to go from the socialist system into a free market economy. And they didn't understand what that fully meant. I'll give you an example. I met with not with one of the ministers, but one of the under-ministers, and he was taking a class on the free market economy. And I asked him where he got his literature from. And he had this simple handbook that was published in Russia. You know, I mean, that's not exactly the breeding ground of a free market economy. So they've had a huge learning curve to undertake. And we've had problems with customs and taxes because they're not sure about the implementation of new laws, foreign investment laws. And the people at the top understand the policies, but they never seem to get it through to the people at the bottom. And the problem with the people at the bottom is that they're paid so poorly that they really don't care. So there's a whole education process to go through there.
Bringing in money from abroad is the only way the Mongolian government will be able to turn its grand schemes into reality. It has precious little cash, but constant demands on the little revenue it can raise at home. But the battle for foreign investment is one which the modernizers still have to win with the former communists.
There are still very, very many hardliners from the old communist system, and many of the old people would like to return to the old communist system because they have grown up with it, they know no other way, and economic reform means nothing to them.
The high priests of market economics, the IMF, have given their blessing to Mongolia's rapid reform programme. Their representative is now installed in the Parliament building, from where the economic gospel is more easily preached.
We are recommending a tighter monetary fiscal policy to bring down inflation, which of course is at its base a tax on the poor and an inhibitor to foreign investment and domestic investment. We are recommending structural reforms in the public sector, in the public enterprise sector, and in the banking sector, just all aimed ultimately at creating an environment for the private sector to take over and become the engine of economic growth.
The trick, so far beyond the politicians, is to combine untrammeled economic development with some kind of social welfare. There are street children everywhere, the next generation of alcoholics. Poverty in urban areas is plain to see. For Western aid agencies, support for market reforms is clouded by concern over the all-too-apparent social consequences.
Well, I think everyone in the poverty field will agree that economic growth is a very powerful motor. However, it is not an either-or situation that you only need to do economic issues or you only need to do social issues. I think they go hand in hand. If you do not cover the social side, you run the risk that poverty will torpedo your economic reform. And likewise, if you don't do the economic reform side, you don't have the growth and the jobs that will ultimately support the social side. So our perspective is that economic and social are intimately related, and you also have to bring in the environment. And these three factors together will be critical for the long-term sustainable growth of Mongolia.
This orphanage and children's centre in Ulaanbaatar is home to some of the most heart-wrenching examples of the social consequences of reform. Street children, many abandoned by parents too poor to care, are brought here. For most, it's a case of learning to be a child again. Many have to be taught how to play with toys. But even the security of this refuge is subject to market forces. The European Union money which funds the centre has run out. The brick factory behind, which supplies the centre and the surrounding area with heating and hot water, has been closed down. With winter temperatures of -30 degrees, the whole area will become uninhabitable. The saving grace and possibly the route to riches could be beneath these hills. Gold and oil. Both are there. An American company has found what it describes as significant oil reserves in the remote south of the country, and gold deposits have been found on the western steppes. It's an act of faith on the Mongolian part that the wealth is there. International investors want more certainty. Mining companies are now sinking exploratory drill holes in the remotest areas of the country. Mongolians have never had the money or the technical expertise to coax the treasure out of the ground before, despite the envious glances being cast from Russia and China on what lies below the surface.
You don't need a map to understand the problems that Mongolia has faced. The mausoleum behind me could be straight off Red Square in Moscow, while the Parliament building is modelled on the Great Hall of the People in Tiananmen Square, Beijing.
President Bagabandi, recently elected and himself a former communist, has the self-imposed task of finding a new way forward for this young democracy without upsetting the all-powerful neighbours.
Your Excellency, how do you see Mongolia's foreign policy, both in relation to China and in relation to Russia?
The key element of our foreign policy is the development of good neighbourly relations with these two superpowers. We are pragmatic people. You of course understand that Mongolia does not have the opportunity to bypass these two major powers and develop relations with other countries.
Under the Constitution, the President is very much a national symbol of this country. When you were elected, what do you think the people were trying to tell you?
My political platform is building democracy, a market economy, and deepening these processes. In economic terms, the main thrust of my policies is the creation of a humane, market-orientated economy.
Do you feel that both your own election and the result of the recent local elections was a rejection of the pace and the speed with which economic reforms had been pursued in the past.
I don't agree with you on that. As you know, Mongolia has embarked on free market reforms since 1990. Naturally, during this period, we've had gains, but also errors. So the most important thing today is to take stock of the errors we have made and multiply the gains which we have achieved. We have to speed up the process of reform in this time of transition. In other words, we have to set up an economy where the private sector will have a predominant position.
For President Bagabandi and the country as a whole, today's inspiration lies in the past, Chinggis Khan. For Mongolians, Chinggis is the embodiment of strength, unity, law and order, and a fierce independence, not the epitome of a merciless warrior, which is how he is caricatured in the West. Even today, the traditional way of life of the country's nomads is praised for its self-sufficiency and admired for its independence. But there's a catch. Nomads contribute little to economic modernization and even less to the taxman. Their skills are of the past. The government's wish to develop a modern, thriving, industrial and manufacturing base is at odds with the nomads' daily lives. There are plans to privatize the grasslands, to introduce Western methods of livestock rearing. For the nomads, there are now great pressures to change their lifestyles and contribute more to aid the creation of a modern image, a modern country, and a modern economy.
The nomads I've just been talking to said that they voted for a market economy at the last general election, but they don't want to change their traditional way of life. That's not what the government wants. It wants them to stay in one place so that it can tax them better. But with so much of the country available simply for the taking, that'll be a tradition they'll find it very hard to change.
It's a dilemma. How can you respect the past and build for a future? How can you use national identity to provide stability when you tear at the heart of a way of life which has remained unchanged for over 600 years, which is part of the national culture? For this nomadic family, the blend of ancient ritual and modern living is a way to survive. The head of the family still dons his traditional dress when visitors arrive at his tent, known as a ger. He tends his herds of goats and horses, as his father and grandfather did. But now, he also works part-time as a lorry driver to supplement his income off the land. His children go to school in the capital, Ulaanbaatar, staying with relations in term time. He's been given the chance of a city apartment, but he refuses to give up his ger and his rituals.
It's all right here. Our living standards were not bad in the past. Now, they're pretty good. Our income is increasing. We now sell our livestock as well as our dairy products. In the past, the state used to buy the hides and the skins at a low price. Now, we're in a market economy. My children are being educated. Our future is out here, not in the city.
But change is already happening around him. Mongolia's new middle classes see the ger as a welcome retreat from city pressures. His neighbours now are more likely to be company bosses, enjoying a weekend in the country and keeping an eye on the company's horses at the same time.
As a Mongolian, I'm a little bit concerned about, about market economy and changing the lifestyle of nomadic people. Because a lot of things, new things will, of course, help to make easy their life. But sometimes, people forget or people don't know old traditions in old things. And, that is a little bit difficult, to keep that lifestyle.
Along with the reassertion of national identity has come the revival of religion. Mongolia practices a form of Tibetan Buddhism. The Dalai Lama is a frequent visitor, much to the annoyance of the Chinese. Once a year, the devout Mongolian tries to reach the Tibetan holy city of Lhasa in a pilgrimage frustrated by hardship and distance and by political obstinacy. In the 1930s, Stalin's purges led to the destruction of over 600 of the country's monasteries and the deaths of over 17,000 monks. Religious icons were smashed or melted down. Only 4 monasteries were spared as relics of what the Russians called the feudal period. Most of these were left as showpieces for the then occasional Western visitor. Since 1991, there's been a religious revival. Half-forgotten Buddhist mantras and rites have re-emerged, kept alive by word of mouth for over 50 years. This, the largest and most ornate monastery, the Gandan, outside Ulaanbaatar, was one of the showcases Stalin spared, at least in part. Its central statue of the Buddha, 20 meters of gold leaf, precious metals and ornate silks, was shipped to Leningrad in 1937 and melted down to make bullets. A supreme irony for a religion dedicated to pacifism. Even today, and despite personal visits by the Mongolian president, Russia will still not confirm what finally happened to the Gandan Buddha. Visitors now can say their prayers in front of a replica. Completed in 1997, after a nationwide fundraising effort and international support. Gold leaf donated by Nepal and Japan. Gold fabrics and silk by India. The rest of the money from the pockets of ordinary worshippers. Wrestling may not be the country's religion, but it's certainly a national passion and obsession. There are few rules and no weight restrictions. Its rituals are as deeply ingrained as sumo in Japan. Its uniqueness is its attraction. The wrestlers can be locked together, motionless, for hours waiting for any slight advantage that will land the winning throw. What could be more Mongolian? What more a symbol of national identity and of the dilemma facing Mongolia today? A modern economy which respects the past, new tactics for an old game. This wrestler is a great titan, a national hero. It's a title he earned by coming first in the wrestling year after year. He's wary of the headlong rush to modernize.
It's a mess. We are changing from one system to another, but living standards are poor. We've got to change, but it's painful and difficult. I hope it's worth the pain in the end.
The applause and friendly smiles on the terraces of the Nadam Stadium hide a titanic struggle over the pace of reform. Rumours of ministerial sackings, by-elections and the cut and thrust of party politics are as much the talk here as the fate of favourite wrestlers, horsemen and archers. They know that this is a turning point for Mongolia if the nation is to survive prosperous and independent. For now, their faith is pinned on the market economy to get the country off its knees. But Mongolian politicians and great titans alike know that there is only one chance to get it right, if a glorious past is not to descend into a wretched future.
And that special report on Mongolia brings us to the end of